It's kind of a little bit difficult, this being the last session of the day. So I'll try to be, as brief as possible. So before we actually start, just a quick introduction. So I'm part of MetricStream's team that builds GRC solutions. Prior to this, I was actually part of Oracle, and then moved here 8 years ago to be part of, part of this team. A hardcore technologist, that's how I would rate myself. And this is what it felt like coming this morning to GIDS, a kid on a candy store. And I hope, most of you would felt the same way too. So, what will we cover today? We will actually look at a case study of what it takes to build a custom JavaScript framework. Now, most of you would have the question, why do I need a custom framework? There are hundreds of custom frameworks that are available on the web right now. And in fact, there is, you're probably spoiled for choices, right? But one of the things, if you look at each of the framework or each of the toolkits, each of them have their own strengths and their own weaknesses. Here's a rough, kind of analysis that we did when we wanted to adopt a framework. We saw some were actually very good, it had great, UI widgets. Some were very lightweight. They were, to be used for a very specific purpose. Some were very structured, like some things like JavaScript MVC, which actually give you an, pre-built architecture where you can, leverage on. And some of them are actually very, mobile friendly, like Sencha, Joe framework. So what happens, two things happen when you actually try to evaluate which framework to actually use. One is you get thoroughly confused. That's the first part. The second is, you actually have to make some tough choices. You'll have to choose something, some features that are available in some framework and not in the other. So you'll have to do a compromise in most cases. And there's also this challenge of, having a lot of homegrown applications. It's okay if you're actually building a new application from scratch. I can go and choose, say I want to use Dojo for my new application building. But what happens if you already have like a hodgepodge of stuff that you're already dealing with, legacy code, some legacy MVC components that you have, some JS that is already written, right? And you don't have the flexibility to actually go and say, let's do this right. We will scrap all the old code and try to implement a new framework. And the other difficulty is, Java or C++ use, things like object-oriented paradigms. But JavaScript is, I would say, somewhere in between. You can use it for object-oriented stuff. You can use it for, procedural kind of stuff. So there are no, clear paradigms that are available where you can actually go and say, this is how I will develop my framework. So, so what is the solution? You could actually go and build your custom framework, which is what we did at MetricStream. So this is a simple, case study, a 10-step process, or 10 important things that we need to take care of when building a custom application. So we were already having some simple JS functions like read, it's mainly for form manipulation. We were also using server-side code generation using Velocity. And essentially, this framework was built to control different aspects of forms, like validation, visualization, manipulation. And right now, it actually coexists with EXTJS. So we have EXTJS 2, as well as this custom framework that we've developed. So this is a simple, like I said, it's a simple cookbook of 10 steps that you need to take care of when building a custom framework. The first part is actually get your namespace right. Namespace usually prevents collisions between other JS libraries that you have. So you basically give your framework an identity of its own. And there are several ways of actually defining your framework. There is a quick and dirty approach. There is a little bit safer approach where you encapsulate some of the methods that you actually use. And you could also use something like EXTJS or Dojo to declare your namespace. So second step in the process of evolving your framework. Go the object-oriented approach. Think of what objects am I going to control with this framework. What are the actions that will be done on the objects, and what are the events that will be generated as a result. Again, we're actually talking about a custom framework coexisting with one of the other frameworks. So the something like EXTJS or jQuery already provide you all of these details. So you could leverage something from those frameworks also. But if you're developing a framework for a limited set of things, then take this approach and list down all your objects, all of your actions, and all of your events. So simple examples, objects, we came up with fields, tabs, buttons that we wanted to control. We wanted to do actions like write, hide, press, and events were like on change or on load. And also think of utilities that you want within your framework. Simple things like iterators, right? Let's say you want to actually iterate over all the rows in your form, or you actually want to do some chaining. So chaining is a classic case where all you do is basically return the object. After doing the manipulation, you return the object back to the caller so that you can perform more actions on it. So how you would actually use it is you would basically take field dot and do multiple actions on that particular object. So think of developing utilities like this, which you can actually use to make your coding faster. And the fourth step, this is basically for caching. So we wanted to actually store some of the most frequently used objects in a local cache. So we developed something like a simple caching function, caching utility that actually stores these as name value pairs. And of course, this is a very simple representation of that function. The actual implementation is much complex, but I just wanted to give you an idea. Also, another thing that that actually happens when your framework coexists with an EXEJS or a jQuery, there are a lot of things that you have to hard code. Suppose you are actually using one of jQuery's classes, you have to make a definite call to jQuery or EXEJS class. The approach that we took was to keep it decoupled. So we want to actually reduce the dependency. So tomorrow, if we actually change over to another framework, it should be an easy transition. So we use something called a publish-subscribe model, or what is called a pub-sub, kind of a model, to basically separate out or decouple the interactions between these two frameworks. This is another important aspect, extensibility. So we had, in the applications GRC applications that we developed, there was a requirement where the product team actually builds some features. And what happens when the customer actually implements it, he would like to do small variations in how the form behaves, which a lot of time actually involved the customer or the implementation team going and hacking the code that the product team has written. So we wanted to actually prevent that. So we introduced something called a queuing concept, where any actions that are to be performed on an object are basically put into a queue. So what happens when the customization is to be done? They basically go and add additional actions to be performed into the same queue. So this way, the amount of code changes that are to be done are kept to minimal, and they're also kept separate from the standard product code that we have. So the bad word that every developer dreads, documentation. And we basically had to do lots of it. The only reason being, a framework is as good as the kind of documentation it provides and kind of help it actually provides. So although this is the least favorite step, I would say it's the most important of all those 10 steps. And we also built some tools to help the developer. So what you're seeing here is basically a small plugin for Programmer's Notepad that we created, where the programmer actually types a few keywords and it shows the different options available, autocomplete. The same thing we have it in Eclipse also. So these are some small things that you can do to help the developer adopt your framework much easier. And the last but one, unit tests. We had a JUnit based framework. I think it was actually covered in one of the earlier sessions that was there. And last but not the least, how do you future-proof the framework? A lot of things are coming with HTML5, a lot of different browsers that you need to actually run this code on. So two simple techniques. One is basically the object detection. So you basically, depending on the browser, you detect whether you want to perform a function or not. And also a feature detection. So you basically detect whether HTML5 is actually available, and if it is available, you leverage its features. Otherwise, you gracefully fall back into say a local caching that you've developed. So basically, to summarize, the 10 steps actually cover the stages around how we conceptualized the custom framework. There are a couple of items around the adoption we did for documentation and building of tools, testing, and then finally the enhancement of the framework so that you keep it open to basically add HTML5 kind of elements going forward. So again, this is not a complete list. These are like the top 10 items that we thought were kind of important to get you started building if you're going to build your own framework. So that's basically all I had. Any questions? Right. If it's something with a long-term project, you can maybe start doing all the test cases and all this stuff. Right. So do you have any plans around those things? The second thing is regarding the frameworks, you had a nice slide at the starting whereby you choose a framework. You have some certain frameworks in each area for widgets and things like that. Have you kind of seen through any framework that is appropriate for each one or anything like that? Right. So that's like I said, that's the first analysis that we did. Okay. So we are actually using EXT.js also, right? So this is not the only custom framework that we're using. So we also use EXT.js, and those are used for specific things like showing widgets. So EXT.js is very good at a lot of widgets that are actually available. So we basically use that for a specific purpose. And the reason we went building our own custom framework was because of the complexity of the different legacy codes, the MEC framework that is available. Putting EXT.js on top of it was not, we had to do a complete rewrite. What kind of frameworks and what kind of design patterns do you follow? So if you actually see, out of all the 6 steps, the first 6 steps, which are the technical ones, they all follow some pattern or the other, right? The first one, namespace, is, there's a specific pattern called namespace pattern. The pub/sub is like an observer, facade, kind of a pattern. So, I mean, each of these are, specific things that follow a certain pattern. So, one of the very good books I would recommend is probably the Beginner Design Patterns by Adi Osmani. So it actually gives you, it's actually a free book, so it actually gives you very good details on what patterns to use and where to use them.